November 6, 1860, the night Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Across America, the country was splitting in two, but deep in Virginia's tobacco country, something else far darker was unfolding. At the Grand Haverford Plantation, a powerful man raised a glass to celebrate Lincoln's victory. By dawn, his lips were black, his throat swollen shut, and his body lay cold beside the fire. The doctor called it a stroke brought on by too much brandy. The county sealed the records within days. But 70 years later, a private journal revealed the truth, something deliberate, something horrifying, and something that began with a single hand-rolled cigar. Tonight, we're traveling back to that night, to the heart of Buckingham County, Virginia, to uncover what really happened inside that smoking room, and why 3 other men would die the same way before anyone realized who was behind it all. Before we continue, I want to know something. If you're listening from Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, or anywhere in tobacco country, drop a comment below and tell me where you're from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. Because here, we dig up stories that history tried to bury. Now, let's begin. Part 1: The Cigar Maker. Buckingham County, Virginia, autumn of 1860. The air was thick with the sweet, earthy scent of curing tobacco. The hills rolled gently across the land, covered in fields that glowed gold beneath the setting sun. It was harvest season, and the smoke from drying barns rose like spirits from the earth. At the center of all this stood the Haverford Plantation, a massive estate of 1,200 acres, with a grand white columned house on a hill, and rows of slave quarters stretching behind it like shadows. The plantation was a world of its own, ruled by one man, Colonel Marcus Haverford. He was 53, tall, broad, and commanding. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp and cold. He had fought in the Mexican War and returned a hero. He had married Catherine Pembroke, the daughter of a wealthy tobacco merchant, and with her fortune he built his empire. To outsiders, he was the perfect Southern gentleman, refined, generous, even progressive for his time. He didn't whip as often as others. He allowed his enslaved people small gardens, even a few hours of rest on Sundays. He liked to think of himself as fair, almost kind. But kindness from a man like Haverford came with chains. He ruled with quiet cruelty, the kind that smiled at you while keeping you in your place. And for those who disobeyed, his overseer, Silas Portwood, made sure punishment was swift and merciless. Among all those who lived and labored under Haverford's rule, one man held a unique place. His name was Benjamin, though everyone called him Benge. He was 34, born on the plantation, and had lived his entire life within its borders. His mother, Celia, had served in the main house before dying of fever when he was a boy. The colonel saw potential in him, a steady hand, a sharp mind, and trained him in tobacco rolling. Benge became the colonel's cigar maker, the best in 3 counties. He knew which leaves to choose, how long to age them, how to flavor the blend with just a touch of rum or brandy. Every cigar the colonel smoked was rolled by Benge's hands. He was trusted, respected even, in a strange, quiet way. He moved through the house like a shadow, never too loud, never too proud, always invisible. But there was one thing the colonel didn't know. Benge could read. His mother had taught him secretly, using an old Bible and torn newspapers. She told him that reading was dangerous, that knowledge could set a man free, or destroy him if he wasn't careful. After her death, Benge kept learning in secret, reading by candlelight when everyone else slept. From those stolen words, he learned about the world beyond the plantation, the cities of the North, the growing cries for abolition, the lines dividing free and slave states. And in one old medical book from the colonel's library, he learned something else, the power of poison. The pages spoke of belladonna and arsenic, of foxglove and nightshade, of plants growing right there in Virginia's woods that could kill a man in silence. But what interested Benge most was something he already knew better than anyone: tobacco. The book explained that tobacco's own substance, nicotine, could be deadly in large enough doses. That the same plant which made fortunes could also take lives. As the election approached, the entire South trembled with uncertainty. Lincoln's name was on everyone's lips. In taverns and parlors, men argued over the fate of the Union. In the quarters, the enslaved whispered quietly about freedom, daring to hope but too afraid to believe. Colonel Haverford hosted a grand dinner 2 weeks before the vote, inviting the most powerful men in Buckingham County. There was laughter, brandy, and endless talk of politics. Benge served the food, poured the drinks, refilled cigars. He moved quietly through the candlelight, catching every word. Some of the guests believed Virginia should secede if Lincoln won. Others urged caution, fearing war. Haverford spoke loudly, declaring his loyalty to the South, but privately, he was hedging his bets. He'd invested money in northern trade, making sure that whatever side won, his fortune would remain secure. To his guests, he was a loyal Southern gentleman. To his wife, he was a shrewd businessman. To Benge, he was something else entirely, a man whose kindness had cost too many lives. That night, when the party ended, the colonel retired to his study. Benge followed, carrying a box of freshly rolled cigars, each one perfect. The colonel took one, lit it, and smiled. "Benge," he said, puffing the smoke slowly, "you do finer work than any man I've ever met. Maybe one day I'll take you to Havana to see how the masters do it." Benge bowed slightly. "Yes, sir," he said softly. The colonel didn't notice the way Benge's eyes lingered on the glowing tip of the cigar, or the faint tremor in his own hand as he drew in the smoke. That night, as the plantation slept, the wind carried the smell of tobacco and burning wood through the hills. And by dawn, the colonel's body was found slumped beside his chair, his lips blackened, his throat swollen shut, his fingers frozen in a desperate grip around the empty cigar. The doctor wrote it off as apoplexy, a sudden stroke, caused by too much excitement. The county sealed the report within a week. But somewhere, hidden deep inside an old trunk, a leather-bound journal told another story. And 70 years later, when that journal was discovered, the truth finally began to surface. The death of Colonel Marcus Haverford had not been an accident. It had been a message, a warning, and the beginning of something much darker. To be continued in Part 2, The Journal of the Doctor. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, about 1,000 words, same style, historical horror for YouTube audience? Studio microphone title: The Tobacco Curse, The Night of the Election Part 2. Hook. YouTube opening scene. On the night of November 6, 1860, the South held its breath. Across Virginia, men gathered in courthouse squares, waiting for the telegraph that would decide their future. But inside one grand plantation house in Buckingham County, something else entirely was waiting, quiet, patient, and deadly. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the tobacco fields, Colonel Marcus Haverford, the master of 1,200 acres, would be dead. The doctor would call it apoplexy, a sudden stroke. But what really killed him was already smoldering between his fingers, a cigar hand rolled by the one man he trusted most. If you're watching from Virginia, Kentucky, or the Carolinas, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. This story began in your backyard, and before it's over, it'll uncover one of the darkest secrets buried in Southern history. And if you love stories like this, real events twisted with mystery and horror, hit that subscribe button now. Now, let's step back to that November night. Part 2: The Night of the Election. 2 weeks before the election, the Haverford Plantation glowed with lamplight. The colonel had invited a dozen of the county's most powerful men, planters, judges, merchants, to his dining table. The men talked loudly, the air thick with cigar smoke and the smell of roasted venison. They spoke of votes and power, of how to control the outcome if Lincoln dared to win. Some whispered about sending men to persuade Republicans not to show up at the polls. A few spoke openly of what would come next: war, secession, and Southern independence. One man, a lawyer named Sutherland, leaned forward over his glass of port. "Lincoln's victory," he said, "will be the spark that lights the powder keg. The South must be ready to stand on her own." The colonel laughed, waving his cigar like a general's baton. "Lincoln's election means nothing without Congress. The man's a small-time lawyer who's about to find out how big this world truly is. Our way of life is ordained by God, gentlemen. It's protected by the Almighty and by good Virginia soil. No Yankee with fancy speeches can change that." The men nodded. Some laughed. And behind them, moving silently from guest to guest, was Benge. He poured their wine, cleared their plates, and listened. He heard every word. When he refilled the colonel's glass, their eyes met for a brief moment. The colonel saw nothing but obedience. Benge saw something else, a man who believed himself untouchable, who had forgotten that those beneath him still thought, still planned, still burned with quiet rage. Later, after the guests left, the colonel retired to his study. He was in a good mood. He wanted one of his finest cigars. Benge brought him a rich Maduro, wrapped in smooth brown leaf, aged for 6 months. The colonel lit it with satisfaction and leaned back in his chair, the glow from the fireplace dancing across his face. "You've outdone yourself with this batch, Benge," he said, admiring the cigar. "The flavor is remarkable. What did you do differently?" "Just a touch more aging, sir," Benge answered softly. "And only the finest leaves from last year's harvest. The ones cured in the north barn. Well, whatever you did, keep doing it. These are better than the Cubans I paid a fortune for." Benge bowed slightly. "Yes, sir." The colonel didn't notice how steady Benge's hands were, or how calm his voice sounded. He didn't notice that when he joked that a box of cigars was worth more than the man who made them, Benge didn't even blink. Inside, Benge felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just patience, like the tobacco drying in the barns, waiting for the perfect time to burn. Election day arrived gray and cold. The air carried the first bite of winter. The colonel rose early, dressed in his finest clothes, and rode into town to cast his vote. Only white landowners could vote, and that meant men like Haverford decided the fate of everyone else. By midnight, the courthouse was packed. Men shouted, argued, and drank as the telegraph messages came in from across the country. And then, just after 1 in the morning, the message arrived: Abraham Lincoln had won. The room exploded. Shouts of anger filled the air. Some men swore the South must secede. Others said they would never recognize a Republican president. The colonel cursed louder than anyone, storming out into the cold night. His carriage tore down the road back to the plantation, wheels skidding in the mud. He burst through the front doors, shouting for his wife, for whiskey, for his cigars. Catherine Haverford appeared in her dressing gown, pale and trembling. "Marcus, what's happened?" "It's done," he roared. "That rail-splitting bastard won. But he won't change a damn thing here. Not in my house. Not on my land. Nothing changes." He slammed his study door so hard the windows shook. Inside, the sound of breaking glass and cursing echoed through the house. The servants slipped back to their quarters. The mistress locked herself in her room. Only Benge remained in the hallway, standing in silence. He knew the colonel would call for him soon. He always did, and when that moment came, Benge was ready. He had been preparing for months. He had studied the colonel's habits, how often he smoked, when he drank, how his body reacted to stress. He had read every line of the old medical text from the colonel's library, learning about nicotine's true nature, not as a pleasure but as a poison. Benge had tested small doses, blending concentrated extracts into the cigars. At first, just enough to make the colonel dizzy, sick to his stomach. Then more, until he found the balance between sickness and suspicion. Now, the final batch sat waiting. These cigars contained 5 times the usual dose, enough to end a man's life in an hour or less, especially one already drunk and furious. The door swung open. The colonel filled the doorway, his cravat loosened, his eyes bloodshot. "Benge, where the hell are you? Bring my cigars, the whole box, and the French brandy." "Yes, sir," Benge said calmly. He retrieved a box from the humidor, a fine wooden case lined with Spanish cedar, identical to the colonel's usual supply. Inside were the cigars Benge had prepared with care and precision, each one a silent weapon. When he returned to the study, the colonel was slumped in his chair, his face pale, his breathing uneven. He looked up, and for the first time, Benge saw something he'd never seen before: fear. "Do you understand what this means, Benge?" the colonel said, voice hoarse. "That man wants to destroy everything we've built. Everything my father built. He wants to tear down our entire world. It must be very troubling, sir, Benge replied, setting the box gently on the desk. Troubling. It's ruinous. There'll be war, mark my words. Benge opened the box and offered him a cigar. The colonel took it, grumbling as he struck a match. War, he muttered again, drawing the first puff. But the South will rise. We'll crush them before they ever cross the Potomac. Benge stood silently by the door, watching the smoke curl upward, thick and blue. The first step of his plan was complete. The colonel didn't know it yet, but every draw he took was bringing him closer to the grave. Outside, the November wind howled across the fields, carrying with it the scent of tobacco, smoke, and something else, something darker. And before the night was over, the house on the hill would fall silent. To be continued in Part 3, The Death of the Master. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, The Death of the Master, next, in the same YouTube narrative horror style in 1000 words? Part 3, The Smoke of Revenge. Hook. They said the colonel died of rage and drink. But in truth, his death came from something far darker, something rolled and lit by the very hands he thought he owned. The night the colonel died began like any other on the Haverford plantation. The lamps glowed low in his study, the air thick with the sweet scent of Virginia tobacco and the sharp bite of brandy. Outside, the wind carried the promise of a coming storm, but inside, the real storm was sitting in a crystal glass, and waiting in a cigar box. It must be troubling, sir, said Benge quietly as he set down the cigar box and poured the colonel another drink. Troubling. The colonel laughed bitterly. It's catastrophic. There will be war, mark my words. And when it comes, every man in Virginia will have to choose a side. He raised his glass high, the brandy trembling in his hand. But not tonight. Tonight, I drink, and smoke, and forget what's coming. He took a cigar from the box, a rich, dark one, perfectly rolled. He admired it, lit it, and drew deeply. The smoke curled through the lamplight like a whisper from hell. At least, he muttered, I still have the best tobacco in Virginia, and a man who knows how to prepare it. Benge stood silently by the door, his face calm, his heart pounding so hard it almost shook his body. The colonel smoked fast, too fast. One cigar gone, then another. He drank heavily between puffs, his talk turning to shouts about northern aggression, about the Constitution, about how men like him built this country. When his words began to slur, he looked at Benge through half-closed eyes. You're a good man, Benge. I've treated you fairly, haven't I? Trusted you with important work. You're grateful for that, aren't you? Yes, sir, Benge said evenly. Very grateful. Inside, he felt nothing. No fear, no pity, only a cold, perfect calm. The colonel reached for another cigar. His hands trembled slightly. Must be the brandy, he muttered, lighting it anyway. He drew the poison smoke deep into his lungs. By the fourth cigar, his face had turned gray. Sweat rolled down his forehead. His breath came in shallow gasps. He tried to rise, but his legs buckled beneath him. Don't feel well, he rasped. Benge, get the doctor. Yes, sir, Benge replied, but he didn't move. He stood still, watching as the colonel's body began to betray him. His pupils widened, his chest heaved, his hands clutched at his throat. Then, with sudden clarity, the colonel understood. His eyes met Benge's, and saw the truth. You, he croaked, voice breaking. You did this. Benge said nothing. He only watched. The colonel gasped and shuddered as the poison burned through him. He tried to speak again, but only a strangled wheeze came out. His hand reached toward Benge, trembling, pleading, or accusing. Then it fell. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of burning cigars. The colonel's body went still. The color drained from his face until he looked almost like wax. Benge waited. When he was sure there was no life left, he stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and then began to clean up. He replaced the poisoned cigars with normal ones. Straightened the desk. Arranged the brandy bottle and glasses. Made everything look exactly as it should, a powerful man undone by his own vices. Then he left the study quietly and returned to his small room behind the main house. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. No joy, no guilt, only silence. At 7 that morning, a maid's scream shattered the calm. The house erupted in chaos. Catherine, the colonel's wife, fainted at the sight of his lifeless body. The overseer, Courtwood, galloped into town for the doctor. Dr. Grimsby examined the corpse, shaking his head. Apoplexy, he declared. Too much brandy, too many cigars, too much anger. I've seen it before, and that was that. Catherine accepted the verdict through tears. The neighbors accepted it over hushed talk and coffee. The servants accepted it because they had to. Only Benge knew the truth, and he carried it quietly, like a stone in his chest. The funeral came 3 days later, under a cold November rain. The church overflowed with mourners, all eager to praise the colonel's greatness. The minister called him a man of honor, a man of vision, a man beloved by all who knew him. Benge stood at the back with the other servants, his head bowed, listening to the lies. He thought of the man who had sold children to pay gambling debts, who had watched men whipped for being slow in the fields. And he said nothing. When the coffin was lowered into the ground beside the colonel's ancestors, Benge felt no peace. Only the weight of what still needed to be done. The plantation fell quiet after that. Catherine locked herself in her room. Courtwood grew crueler, beating workers for the smallest mistakes. But war was coming. Everyone could feel it. The world outside was cracking open, and soon, even this plantation would not be safe. Benge began to plan. He would run, not just to escape, but to make everything the colonel had built fall to ashes. In the colonel's study were papers, deeds, contracts, letters. Evidence of hidden gold, secret weapons, Confederate deals. Benge had seen them all. Memorized names, numbers, and locations. He knew who funded the war and who pretended to be innocent. That knowledge was power. Power he would carry north, to freedom. 3 nights before Catherine planned to leave for Richmond, Benge made his move. He unlocked the colonel's study with a key he had crafted from wax weeks earlier. Working by candlelight, he studied the papers again, memorizing every detail. Then he slipped back to his room and waited for the right night. When the clouds rolled in and the moon vanished, he disappeared. By morning, he was gone. The overseer raged, the search parties scoured the woods, and Catherine wept, not from loss, but confusion. Why would he run? She asked. We treated him well. No one could answer. Because they would never understand that to a man who had been owned, even death was better than comfort in chains. Benge wasn't on the road north. He was heading west, through the mountains, toward the Underground Railroad, and toward the freedom he had long dreamed of. But freedom always comes with a price. And for Benge, that price was just beginning to be paid. To be continued in Part 4. Would you like me to make Part 4 next? Continuing Benge's escape through the Underground Railroad, with more suspense and dark historical tension. Part 4. The Road Through Darkness. Hook. They thought Benge vanished into the night. But he hadn't vanished, he was being reborn. Each step into the dark woods took him closer to freedom, and closer to something else waiting among the trees. The rain fell softly over the Virginia hills as Benge slipped away from the plantation. The night was heavy and moonless, the clouds thick like ink over the land. Every sound seemed louder than it should be, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft breath of his own fear. He carried nothing but a small bag, a knife, and the memory of every map he had studied in secret. He knew the patrol roads. He knew the rivers. And most of all, he knew that every step north was a step toward a world that might finally call him a man. He moved fast through the tall grass, his feet sinking into the wet earth. Behind him, the lights of the plantation glowed faintly in the distance. Somewhere back there, Courtwood was probably shouting orders, dogs barking, torches flaring in the dark. But Benge kept walking. He would not run yet. Running made noise. Running left trails. He followed the sound of a creek that wound through the woods. The cold water bit at his ankles, but it washed away his tracks. He thought of the colonel's pale face as he died, the realization in his eyes. For years, that man had looked at him as if he were nothing. But in the end, it had been Benge who decided the moment of his death. The thought did not comfort him. It only reminded him how fragile life could be. The forest thickened as the night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and something large moved in the underbrush. Benge gripped his knife tighter. Every shadow looked alive, every whisper of wind sounded like a voice calling his name. He found an old tobacco barn, half collapsed and covered in vines, and decided to rest until dawn. He crawled inside, lighting no fire, just curling up in a corner. Rain dripped through holes in the roof. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come easily. In the silence, he heard footsteps. Slow, careful, measured. His heart raced. He held his breath, gripping the knife tighter. The footsteps stopped right outside the barn door. Then a voice, low and calm, said, "You don't need that knife, friend." A lantern light flickered through the doorway. The figure who stepped in was a tall man in a worn coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was pale and lined, his eyes sharp but kind. "Name's Elias," the stranger said softly. "You're far from home, aren't you?" Benge said nothing, still unsure if this man was friend or foe. "I help people," Elias continued. "People like you. There's a path through these woods. Not safe, not easy. But it leads north. I can guide you to the first station." Benge studied him for a moment, then slowly lowered the knife. "You work for the railroad?" he asked quietly. Elias smiled faintly. "Let's just say I lay the tracks." For the next 2 nights, they traveled together, through forests, across creeks, and over rough hills. They spoke little, but Benge learned enough to know Elias was part of a secret network that stretched all the way to Pennsylvania. Safe houses, signal lanterns, hidden rooms beneath barns. But danger followed close behind. On the 3rd night, as they approached an abandoned mill near the edge of the Blue Ridge, they heard dogs. The sound echoed through the valley, sharp, angry barks that grew louder by the minute. "They're close," Elias muttered. "Slave catchers." They ran. Branches tore at their clothes, roots tripped their feet, the dogs closing in with every heartbeat. They reached the mill just as the first torches appeared on the ridge behind them. Inside, Elias shouted. They slipped through a broken door and climbed the rotting stairs to the upper floor. Through a crack in the boards, Benge saw the hunters below, 3 men on horseback, rifles slung across their backs, dogs straining at their leashes. "Spread out," one of the men barked. "He's close." The dogs sniffed, growling, their noses turning toward the stairs. Benge felt sweat roll down his neck. He held his breath. Elias pointed toward a trapdoor in the floor. They crawled inside, pulling it shut above them just as the door below creaked open. Boots thudded across the old wood. A dog sniffed nearby and began to bark wildly. Benge's pulse hammered in his ears. One of the men kicked at the floor above the trapdoor. The wood groaned but held. "Nothing here," one voice said finally. "We'll check the river." Their footsteps faded. The dogs barking moved away. Still, Elias and Benge stayed hidden for nearly an hour, barely breathing. When they finally climbed out, the air felt thin and cold. Elias turned to him, his face pale. "That was too close. We need to move fast." By dawn, they reached a farmhouse nestled deep in the valley. A lantern burned in the window, a signal of safety. A woman in her 40s opened the door, her face tired but kind. "Name's Martha," she said softly. "You're safe here. For now." She fed them bread and soup, and for the first time in days, Benge tasted warmth. He thanked her quietly, his voice shaking. But safety was an illusion. That night, Benge woke to the sound of thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It was hooves, a dozen of them, pounding down the dirt road. Martha rushed into the room. "They found us," she whispered. Elias grabbed Benge's arm. "Through the cellar. There's a tunnel." They ran through the narrow passage as men shouted above. The tunnel led to the woods behind the farmhouse, and they stumbled out into the rain just as flames began to rise behind them. Benge turned once, watching the fire consume the house. Martha's lantern light vanished into the smoke. He didn't know if she survived. They ran until the fire was only a red glow behind the trees. When they finally stopped, Elias fell to his knees, coughing hard. "Go," he rasped. "Don't wait for me." Benge shook his head. "No, not leaving you. You have to," Elias said. "There's a crossing 2 miles north, an old church cellar. Tell them Elias sent you." Benge hesitated, then nodded. He gripped the man's shoulder. Thank you. Elias managed a faint smile. Don't thank me. Just make it count. Then Benge turned and ran through the dark woods, the rain soaking his clothes, the sound of pursuit still faint in the distance. Every breath burned. Every step felt like the last. But he kept moving, toward the north, toward freedom, toward whatever waited next. Behind him, the forest whispered with wind and ghosts. The road ahead was long, but there was no turning back now. He was no longer Benge the servant. He was Benge the survivor. And in the haunted woods of Virginia, survival was just another word for vengeance. To be continued in Part 5. Would you like me to write Part 5 next, where Benge reaches the old church cellar, uncovers dark secrets of the Underground Railroad, and faces something supernatural tied to his past? Part 5. The Church Beneath the Earth. Hook. He thought the danger was behind him. But the real darkness wasn't the men with torches or the hounds in the night. It was waiting underground, where faith and fear met beneath the ruins of an old church. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the world was still soaked in fog. Benge moved through the woods like a shadow, every muscle sore, every breath sharp and cold. He had been walking for hours, guided by Elias's last words. There's a crossing 2 miles north, Elias had said. An old church cellar. Tell them Elias sent you. The forest opened onto a clearing where the remains of a wooden church leaned crooked against time. Its steeple had collapsed years ago, and ivy wrapped around the blackened boards like vines around a corpse. The ground smelled of damp soil and old smoke. Benge stood still, scanning the trees. No sound, no birds, even the wind had gone silent. He approached slowly. The church door hung half open. He pushed it wider and stepped inside. The pews were broken, the altar covered in dust. A cracked Bible lay open on the pulpit, its pages fluttering in the faint breeze. He whispered softly, Elias sent me. Nothing. Then, from beneath the floorboards, came the faint sound of metal scraping against stone. Benge froze. Another sound followed, the creak of a hidden latch. A panel in the floor lifted, and a face appeared. It was a man, middle-aged, with rough hands and eyes that darted like a hunted animal's. Who are you? The man asked sharply. Name's Benge, he said quietly. Elias sent me. The man stared for a moment, then nodded. Come quick, before someone sees. Benge climbed down into the darkness. The passage below smelled of earth and old wood. Lanterns flickered along the walls, lighting a narrow tunnel that stretched into the ground. At the end of the tunnel was a small underground chamber. A woman sat there with 2 children, their faces pale and frightened. Another man stirred a pot over a small fire. The air was thick with smoke and fear. You made it, the man said. Elias said you might come. I'm Samuel. Benge nodded. He told me this place was safe. Samuel gave a tight smile. Safe as anywhere can be these days. You can rest a while, but we move again at sundown. Benge sat against the dirt wall, exhaustion catching up with him. The warmth of the fire felt like a miracle. The children huddled together, whispering prayers under their breath. But there was something else here. Something he couldn't name. A coldness in the air that didn't come from the earth. A faint hum, like distant singing, echoing through the tunnels. It was soft at first, almost soothing. Then it grew louder. Benge looked around. You hear that? Samuel frowned. Hear what? The singing. Samuel's face went pale. You hear them? Them. Benge repeated. Samuel leaned close. Don't listen. Don't follow the sound. Before Benge could ask more, the lanterns flickered violently. The flame hissed, guttered, then flared again. The children cried out. Stay calm, Samuel said quickly. It happens sometimes when the wind changes. But there was no wind here. No movement of air at all. Benge stood, staring into the dark tunnel that led deeper underground. The singing grew clearer, a woman's voice, soft and mournful, singing an old hymn he remembered from the plantation chapel. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. He stepped toward the sound before he realized what he was doing. Each note pulled at something deep inside him, grief, guilt, memory. He saw flashes in his mind, the colonel's face as he died, the whip cracking across the backs of men and women, the cries of children sold away. He stumbled forward until Samuel grabbed his arm. Don't, Samuel hissed. It's not real. That's what the spirits do. They call to you. Benge blinked, shaking his head. Spirits. This church, Samuel whispered. Before it was a station, it was something else. A place where they held prayers for the dead. When the war started, the old minister hid runaways in the cellar. One night, soldiers found them. Burned them alive down here. The children began to cry again, clutching each other. The woman crossed herself and whispered, they never left. The air turned colder. The lantern dimmed. The singing stopped. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then came the whispering. Hundreds of voices, faint but desperate, echoing from the walls. Benge felt his skin crawl. He turned in circles, eyes wide, trying to find the source. The whispers grew into words. Help us. They burned us. Don't forget us. Samuel raised his voice. Don't speak to them. Just pray. Benge clenched his fists. They want something. They want peace, Samuel said quietly. But none of us can give it. A shadow flickered across the tunnel mouth. It moved like smoke, like the outline of a person made from darkness. Then another shape appeared, and another. Figures in tattered clothes, faces twisted with grief, stepped out of the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. One of them reached out a hand toward Benge. He stepped back, heart pounding. What do you want? He whispered. The ghost's voice was faint but clear. You carry his sin. The colonel, Benge asked. The ghost nodded slowly. You freed yourself, but not your soul. The shadows began to circle him, whispering in broken tones, their words blurring into the sound of crackling fire. He could smell smoke again. The church seemed to shift, the walls warping. As if time itself was folding. He was back in the burning barn. The screams filled the air. He saw faces. The colonel, the enslaved, Elias, Martha, all flickering in the flames. Then everything went silent. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. When he looked up again, the spirits were gone. Only Samuel remained, staring at him with fear and pity. You saw them, Samuel said softly. Benge nodded, trembling. They said I carry his sin. Samuel put a hand on his shoulder. Maybe they're right, but sin burns the same no matter who holds it. That night, no one slept. When dawn came, the small group prepared to move. Samuel led them through another tunnel that opened onto a narrow trail along the river. As Benge looked back, the ruined church stood silent in the mist. He thought he saw a flicker of light in the doorway, like a candle burning far beneath the ground. He whispered, rest now. But deep inside, he knew the dead weren't finished with him yet. He had escaped the plantation, escaped the hunters, escaped the past. But the past wasn't done chasing him. To be continued in Part 6. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, where Benge reaches the next station, a quiet farmhouse that hides darker secrets, and where the haunting becomes more violent and personal? Part 6. The House by the River. Hook. He thought he had escaped the haunted church, but some sins don't stay buried. As he followed the river north, something began following him, something that knew his name, his past, and his deepest guilt. The morning light was pale and weak, barely cutting through the fog that rose from the river. Benge walked along the muddy path, his clothes still damp, his mind heavy with what he had seen underground. The memory of those ghostly voices clung to him. He could still hear the echo, you carry his sin. Every time the wind shifted, he thought he heard whispers in it. Samuel and the others had gone another way. They said their route led to safety, to people who could help. But Benge didn't follow. Something in him needed to move alone now. He didn't know where he was going, only that the river kept calling him forward. By midday, he reached an old bridge. It was half collapsed, the wood eaten by time, but still passable. On the other side stood a farmhouse, white once, now gray and peeling, with vines climbing up the porch. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and lazy. He hesitated. Something about it felt too quiet. But hunger drove him closer. When he knocked, the door creaked open by itself. Hello, he called. No answer. Only the soft sound of water dripping somewhere inside. He stepped in. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like decayed fruit. The living room was filled with old furniture covered in dust. A clock ticked on the wall, slow and heavy. Then came the voice. Hungry traveler. He turned fast. An old woman stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her back slightly bent, her gray hair tied up in a loose bun. Her face was kind but pale, her eyes sharp and knowing. You look like you've been walking through the grave, she said. Just passing by, Benge replied carefully. I didn't mean to intrude. Nonsense, she said with a thin smile. No one passes by here unless they need something. Come in, warm yourself. He followed her into the kitchen. A small fire burned in the stove. She ladled soup into a bowl and handed it to him. You're kind, he said. I've seen too many wanderers go cold in this land, she replied softly. The war left ghosts everywhere. You feel them too, don't you? Her words froze him. What do you mean? He asked. She smiled sadly. This house sits on old ground. There was a river battle here long ago. They say the soldiers still march in the fog at night, looking for home. He forced a small laugh, but his hand trembled. I've had enough of ghosts lately. The old woman looked at him carefully. No one ever has enough. Ghosts follow those who owe them. He put down the spoon. You talk like you know them. Her eyes grew distant. Oh, I do. I once tried to help them find peace. But some spirits don't want peace. They want to be remembered. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up. A faint knock sounded at the window. 1, 2, 3. The old woman didn't look up. They're early tonight, she whispered. Benge turned toward the sound. Through the foggy glass, he saw shapes, faint, moving, like men standing by the riverbank. He stepped closer, heart racing. Who are they? Don't open it, she said sharply. Once you look too long, they see you back. But he had already seen. The figures were soldiers, uniforms soaked and torn, eyes hollow like burned-out lamps. One of them raised a hand as if in salute. Then another pointed straight at him. Benge stumbled back. They're calling me. The old woman stood, her voice low and urgent. Then they've found you. You need to leave before nightfall. He grabbed his coat. Why me? Her eyes filled with something between pity and fear. Because the sin you carry isn't just yours. It belongs to the land now. Wherever you go, it remembers. As he turned to leave, something slammed against the door. Hard. The wood rattled. Another slam followed. Then a third. The woman's face went white. They've come inside. The lantern flickered. The temperature dropped. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Benge moved slowly toward the front room, every instinct screaming to run. The air felt thick, heavy, alive. He saw his breath fog in front of him. The door burst open. Fog poured in, swirling like smoke. From it, the figures stepped forward, the same soldiers, faces gray and eyes burning faintly blue. The leader was tall, his uniform torn across the chest, revealing the mark of a bullet wound. Why are you following me? Benge demanded, his voice trembling. The ghost spoke in a voice like wind through a grave. Because you were there. You carried the flame. Benge shook his head. I didn't kill anyone. I was trying to live. You took the colonel's life, the ghost said. And with it, his curse. The house began to groan, the walls bending as if the earth itself was moving. The old woman screamed from the kitchen, don't let them touch you. The ghost stepped closer. You must face what you've done. Or the fire will follow forever. Images flashed in Benge's mind, the burning plantation, Elias's scream, the colonel falling, blood soaking the dirt. He saw it all again, brighter, hotter, as if the fire still burned behind his eyes. The spirits began to fade, dissolving into mist. But one voice lingered, softer now. Free us, it whispered. Free yourself. And then they were gone. The house was silent again. The old woman stood in the doorway, trembling. They won't stop, she said quietly. Not until you return to where it began. Benge looked at her. The plantation. She nodded. There's something left there. Something that binds them, and you. He stepped outside. The fog had lifted slightly. The river shimmered under the moonlight, calm and silver. But as he looked at the water, he saw faces ripple beneath the surface, men, women, children, staring up at him with sorrow in their eyes. He whispered, I'll set you free. And the water moved as if it heard him. He turned north again, following the river. The wind whispered his name, low and steady, like a warning and a promise. The road ahead was darker now, but he didn't turn back. Because he knew, the only way out of the haunting was through it. The past was waiting for him. And this time, it would not let him go easily. To be continued in Part 7. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, where Benge returns to the ruins of the old plantation, and discovers that something far older and more powerful than ghosts is buried beneath it? Part 7. The Return to Haverford Plantation. Hook. He thought he had escaped the ghosts, but the river only carried him back to where it all began. The fire might have burned the plantation down, but its soul was still alive, waiting for him to come home. The road twisted through miles of empty land, the kind that seemed forgotten by time. Trees leaned close over the path, their branches tangled like fingers whispering secrets. The moon hung low and pale, watching as Benge walked toward the place he had promised never to see again. He had followed the river for 2 days, sleeping under the trees, drinking from shallow pools, and listening to the sounds of the night. Sometimes, he thought he heard footsteps behind him. Sometimes, he was sure he saw shadows moving along the water. But when he turned, there was nothing there, only the whisper of the wind and the slow rush of the river. By the third night, the land began to change. The trees grew thinner, the soil darker. The air carried a familiar scent, burnt wood and old ash. Benge knew what that smell meant. He was close. At sunrise, he saw the first remains of Haverford Plantation. The fields were nothing but weeds now, tall and gray in the cold wind. The big house, once shining white, was a black skeleton of beams and brick. The fire had eaten everything except the stone fireplace and part of the front steps. Benge stood there a long time, staring at what was left of the place that had shaped his life. "This is where it began," he whispered. "And where it ends." He walked toward the ruins. Each step stirred up the smell of old smoke. Birds didn't sing here, even the insects were silent. Inside the charred remains, the floor was covered with broken glass, scorched nails, and the bones of furniture that once gleamed with polish. The grand staircase had collapsed, but the study, the colonel's study, still stood, half-burned but intact. He pushed open the door. It creaked slowly, like something waking up. The room was dark. The ceiling had holes where the fire had burned through, letting in thin streams of light. The leather chair was gone, melted into black sludge. But the desk, the colonel's heavy oak desk, was still there. On it lay the humidor. The same wooden box that had once held the cigars. The one Benge had poisoned. He walked closer, his hands shaking. The box was open. Inside were 2 cigars, untouched, resting like relics. The air around them smelled faintly of tobacco and something else, something metallic. He reached out but stopped when he heard it. A breath, slow, deep, and close. "Back again," a voice said behind him. He froze. The voice was low and thick with anger, the same voice that used to call his name through the halls. "Colonel," Benge whispered. "You thought it was over," the voice said. "You thought you could poison the master and walk free." Benge turned slowly. The figure standing there was half shadow, half smoke. The colonel's face flickered in and out of shape, one moment whole, the next a charred skull. His eyes glowed faintly like embers. "I did what I had to," Benge said, backing away. "You took everything from me." The colonel laughed, a sound like cracking wood. "You think death freed you? Death freed me too. Now we belong to this place together." The room began to twist. The walls pulsed as if they were breathing. The desk rattled. The cigars rolled to the edge and dropped to the floor. "You killed me slow," the colonel hissed. "Now feel what slow death is." Benge fell to his knees as the floor turned to mud beneath him. From the black earth, pale hands reached up, men, women, children, all the souls that had died here. Their faces were familiar. He had known them all. "Help me," he cried. But their voices rose in a single whisper. "You left us burning." The colonel stepped forward, his boots sinking into the ground like smoke sinking into cloth. He knelt beside Benge and whispered in his ear. "You gave me poison. I give you truth. You and I, we are the same." Benge's eyes filled with tears. "I'm nothing like you. You served me in life," the colonel said. "Now serve me in death." The ground shuddered. The house moaned like it was alive again. The ghosts around him screamed, not in anger now, but in pain. Light burst through the cracks in the walls, firelight, bright and orange. "No," Benge shouted, "not again." He ran toward the doorway, stumbling through the smoke. The ghostly flames licked at his clothes but didn't burn. They were illusions, memories, but the heat felt real. Outside, the sun had disappeared. The sky turned red, and the trees swayed as if in a storm. The wind carried whispers, hundreds of them, voices of the enslaved, calling his name, begging for freedom. He dropped to his knees, clutching the dirt. "Tell me how to set you free." The whispers grew louder, almost like chanting. Then one voice rose above the rest, calm, steady, and clear. It was Elias, his friend, his brother. "Find what binds us," the voice said. "The Master's promise still lies beneath the roots." And then the voices were gone. The wind stopped. The plantation fell silent again. Benge stood, breathing hard. He looked toward the big oak tree that had stood near the house for generations. Beneath its roots, he remembered, was where the colonel had buried a chest, gold, deeds, and papers. The symbols of his power. Maybe that was it, the thing that held the curse in place. He walked toward the tree, every step feeling heavier. The ground was soft, almost breathing. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his hands. The dirt came away easily, almost too easily, like the land wanted him to find it. After a few minutes, his fingers hit wood. He brushed it clean. The chest was still there, black with age, but unbroken. He pried it open. Inside were coins, letters, and a small leather-bound book. When he opened the book, the first line made his heart freeze. "Property of Colonel Nathaniel Haverford. May my blood and my land remain forever bound." The curse wasn't just words. It was written into the land itself. Benge closed the book and whispered, "Then I'll unbind it." But as he stood, the air behind him changed. The colonel's voice whispered one last time. "You can't destroy what you are part of." Benge turned, but the voice faded into the wind. The night was quiet again. The ruins of the house stood black against the red sky. Benge looked down at the chest, the book glowing faintly in his hands. He knew what he had to do. The fire wasn't over. The haunting had just begun. He lifted the book, his eyes filled with grim resolve. Tomorrow, he would burn it. But tonight, the ghosts watched. And somewhere deep in the earth, something moved, something that wasn't ready to be destroyed. To be continued in Part 8. Would you like me to continue with Part 8, where Benge discovers that burning the book awakens something older than the colonel, something buried beneath the plantation long before either of them existed? Part 8. The book beneath the roots. Hook. He thought destroying the book would end the curse. But when he tried to burn it, something older than the colonel woke up. Beneath the soil, something that had been waiting for centuries to rise again. The next morning, the sky over Haverford Plantation was the color of ash. No birds sang. No wind stirred the trees. Everything felt still, like the land was holding its breath. Benge sat near the old oak tree, staring at the small leather-bound book resting in his lap. The same book that carried the colonel's curse. The same one that whispered to him in his sleep. He hadn't slept all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces in the dark, the colonel, Elias, and dozens of others. Some pleading, some accusing, all trapped. The words on the book's first page burned in his memory. "May my blood and my land remain forever bound." He didn't know if destroying the book would free them. But he knew it was the only chance he had. He gathered broken pieces of wood from the ruins and built a small fire in front of the tree. He opened the book one last time. The pages were filled with strange symbols, part English, part Latin, part something else. He didn't understand them, but he could feel their power. "This ends now," he whispered. He tossed the book into the fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flames turned blue. The air grew thick and heavy. The ground beneath him trembled. A sound rose from deep in the earth, not a human sound, not an animal sound. It was older, deeper, almost like the land itself was groaning. The blue fire roared higher. Benge stumbled back as the book began to scream. The pages curled, but they didn't burn. Instead, they seemed to melt into the dirt, like the ground was swallowing them. Then the voices came, hundreds of them, men, women, children, all crying out at once. Their voices echoed across the fields. Free us! Free us! Free us! Benge fell to his knees. I'm trying, he shouted. Tell me how. The wind picked up, swirling the ash into shapes. Faces formed in the smoke, faces he recognized. People he had worked beside, laughed with, lost. One voice cut through the rest. You cannot burn what is buried in blood. Benge turned toward the voice. It was Elias. His form glowed faintly in the blue light. The book is just the key, Elias said. The curse runs deeper, in the soil, in the bones, in the blood that feeds this land. You must break it at its root. The root, Benge whispered. Elias pointed toward the oak tree. There. Benge looked at the massive trunk, gnarled and ancient. The roots spread wide beneath it, tangled like veins. He moved closer, the air growing colder with each step. At the base of the tree, he saw it, something shining between the roots. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt. It wasn't a stone, it was metal, a chain, thick, iron links that disappeared deep into the earth. The metal was old, covered in rust and something darker. He followed it with his eyes, realizing it looped around the tree and vanished beneath the roots again, as if it were holding something there. Elias's voice echoed softly. That chain binds more than wood. It binds souls. Benge's hands trembled. He grabbed a piece of broken metal from the ruins, a shard of the colonel's desk, and began to dig. The earth resisted at first, heavy and wet. But then it loosened, almost willingly, as if it wanted to give up its secret. The chain went deeper than he expected. It wrapped around something buried, something big. His fingers brushed against bone. He froze. The shape beneath the soil wasn't just one skeleton. It was many. Skulls, ribs, arms, all tangled together, all bound by the same chain. A burial pit. His stomach turned as he realized what it was. These were the men and women who had vanished from the plantation. The ones who had tried to run. The ones the colonel had made examples of. The earth trembled again. A deep, low rumble filled the air. Elias's voice grew louder. Break the chain. Set them free. Benge raised the metal shard and brought it down hard against the links. Sparks flew. He struck again and again. The first chain snapped with a sharp crack. The air shifted. The sky darkened. Then another broke. And another. Each time, the ground shook and the blue fire flared brighter. The ghosts around him began to rise, their faces filled with light. Keep going, they cried. He struck until his arms ached, until his hands bled. Finally, with one last blow, the final link shattered. The sound that followed was like thunder, rolling across the fields. The oak tree shuddered, its branches twisting. The roots ripped through the ground, splitting the earth wide open. A gust of cold wind tore through the ruins, carrying the voices of the freed souls into the night sky. For the first time in years, the air over Haverford felt light. The heaviness lifted. The silence was broken by a single sound, a bird's cry, sharp and clear. Benge fell back, breathing hard. The blue light faded, leaving only the soft glow of morning. Elias stood nearby, smiling faintly. It's done, Elias said. You did it. Benge looked around at the ruins, at the broken tree, at the empty land that finally seemed at peace. Then it's over. Elias's smile faded. No, something still sleeps beneath. You broke the curse that bound us. But you also opened the door that held it. What do you mean? Benge asked, fear creeping into his voice. Elias looked toward the split earth. The colonel's curse was built on something ancient. Something this land carried long before either of us. You didn't destroy it. You woke it. The wind shifted again, blowing cold from the broken ground. A whisper rose from the darkness below, not human, not ghostly, but ancient. Benge took a step back, staring into the crack that now split the field in two. Down there, something moved. It wasn't a spirit. It wasn't a man. It was something older. Something that had been buried long before the first brick of Haverford Plantation was ever laid. He looked at Elias, but the spirit was already fading. Run, Elias whispered, before it remembers your name. And then he was gone. The wind roared. The crack in the ground widened, glowing faintly from within. Benge turned and ran into the rising sun, his heart pounding. Behind him, the land groaned again, like something ancient and hungry was waking up after a very long sleep. To be continued in Part 9. Would you like me to continue with Part 9, where Benge learns the true origin of the evil buried beneath the plantation, a horror older than slavery, older than America itself? Part 9. The Thing Beneath Haverford. Hook. He thought he freed the souls of the dead. But in doing so, Benge woke something far worse, something that had been buried under Haverford long before men called it a plantation. The sun climbed slowly over the horizon, spilling weak light over the shattered fields of Haverford. The once proud plantation now lay in ruins. Smoke still rose from the oak tree that had split open like a wound in the earth. Benge stood at the edge of the field, his clothes torn, his skin streaked with dirt and sweat. The morning air was heavy, almost alive. Each breath tasted like iron and ash. He had freed the ghosts. He had broken the chains. But something else had come awake. From the split earth, a low hum echoed, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of breathing. Sometimes it grew so faint he thought it had stopped. Then it would rise again, stronger, pulsing beneath the ground like a heartbeat. Benge turned toward the woods. He needed to move. He needed to get far away before anyone came back to the plantation, before the soldiers, or worse, whatever was beneath the soil, found him. He started walking, following a narrow path that led north toward the river. But after a few miles, he felt that strange pull. It was like the ground itself was calling him back. Every step away made his chest tighten. Every thought screamed to turn around. The voice of Elias echoed faintly in his mind. You woke it. Run before it remembers your name. He forced himself forward, but the forest around him began to change. The trees grew darker, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of rot. He stumbled upon a small stream and knelt to drink, trying to calm the shaking in his hands. That's when he saw it. In the reflection of the water, the ground behind him moved. Not like wind in grass. It shifted, as if something was crawling just beneath the surface, rippling the soil like waves. He stood slowly, his heart pounding. The rippling stopped. Then a sound broke the silence, a whisper, carried on the wind. His name, Benge. He spun around, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing, only shadows and fog. He turned back toward the water, and froze. In the reflection, a figure stood behind him. Tall, pale. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes burned faintly red, like coals. He spun again. The figure was gone. The forest was empty. He backed away, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, the breath knocked from his chest. When he looked up, the trees around him seemed closer, leaning in like they were watching. The whisper came again, louder this time. You broke the chain. Benge's voice trembled. Who are you? The answer came not in words, but in feeling, a rush of ancient hunger, a cold wave that filled his mind. Images flashed before his eyes. Not just the Colonel, not just slavery, but centuries earlier, a time when this land was wild and untamed. When men in strange robes carved symbols into stones and offered blood to something that lived beneath the roots. Something that promised them prosperity, crops that would never fail, power that would never fade. But when they broke their vows, it turned on them. The earth opened and swallowed them whole. And their screams became part of the land. Benge staggered to his feet, gasping for breath. The vision faded, but the feeling didn't. The thing beneath Haverford was old, older than the Colonel, older than the first settlers. And now, it was awake. He ran through the forest, branches clawing at his skin. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stop. But every path he took seemed to twist back toward the plantation. By nightfall, he found himself standing in front of the split oak again. The crack in the ground had grown wider, pulsing with a faint red glow. The air was alive with whispers. Faces formed in the drifting mist, faces of the freed souls, twisted in fear. Why did you free us? One of them cried. You opened the door. I didn't know, Benge said. I wanted to help you. Elias appeared beside him, his form flickering like candlelight. His voice was filled with sorrow. You can't help what you don't understand. The Colonel's curse came from this thing. He bargained with it, bound his power to it. Now that he's gone, it wants a new master. Benge shook his head. I don't want power. That doesn't matter, Elias said. It chose you. The ground shuddered violently. The crack split wider. From the glowing pit, something began to rise. At first, it looked like black smoke, twisting and writhing. Then it took shape. A mass of shadow and bone, with long arms and no face, its form constantly shifting. The smell of decay filled the air. It towered above them, its voice rumbling like thunder. Blood for blood, master for master. Benge fell to his knees, covering his ears. The sound was unbearable. Elias reached toward him, shouting something, but his voice was lost in the roar. The creature extended one long arm, its fingers stretching like roots toward Benge. The air grew cold, his vision blurred. For a moment, he saw flashes, the colonel shaking hands with a robed figure, blood dripping into the earth, fire burning in the night. The same deal, centuries apart. Always the same promise. Wealth, power, control. But every promise came with a price. The creature's hand touched his chest, and the world went black. When Benge opened his eyes again, the sky was gray. The oak tree was gone. The ground was smooth, as if nothing had ever happened. The plantation looked whole again. The house stood tall, the fields golden and rich. Voices drifted from the porch. Laughter, music. For a brief moment, he thought he'd imagined it all. Until he looked down at his hands. They were pale, thin. His reflection in the window wasn't his own. It was the colonel's. And from somewhere deep inside him, a cold voice whispered, blood for blood. The plantation had been restored, not to life, but to its curse. The circle had closed. Benge screamed, but the sound that came out wasn't his own. To be continued in Part 10, the chilling finale, where the truth of Haverford's curse and Benge's fate are finally revealed. Would you like me to continue with Part 10, the final chapter, where the full horror of what the land truly demands is unleashed? Part 10. The Curse of Haverford ends tonight. Hook. He thought he escaped the curse. But the curse didn't just live in the land, it lived in him. And tonight, the true face of Haverford would rise again. The evening light fell softly over the Haverford plantation. The fields looked golden and calm, the air quiet, peaceful, too peaceful. From a distance, it could have been any other southern estate, rich with beauty and history. But inside, behind those whitewashed walls, something unnatural stirred. Benge stood before a tall mirror in the grand hall. The reflection staring back wasn't his. It was the colonel's, cold eyes, proud face, the same cruel smirk. He pressed his hands against the glass, trying to see his own reflection through it. Nothing changed. His voice trembled. What did you do to me? The colonel's reflection smiled wider. You accepted my place, boy. The land needs a keeper. Now you're Haverford. Benge stumbled back, gasping. His heart raced, but his pulse felt faint, almost like it wasn't his own anymore. He could feel the heartbeat of the plantation itself inside his chest, slow, heavy, ancient. He ran outside, hoping for air, for escape. The moment his bare feet touched the dirt, whispers rose around him. The trees swayed though there was no wind. The house creaked behind him, alive with voices that weren't human. The souls he freed now circled the property, faint outlines glowing in the dark. Their faces were sad, not angry, like they pitied him. Elias appeared among them, his body faint and transparent. His voice was soft, but it shook with pain. It's over, Benge. The curse chose you. No, Benge said, his voice cracking. There has to be a way. I freed you, Elias. I broke the chains. Elias shook his head slowly. You broke the wrong chains. The ones that held the curse down, you shattered them too. Benge dropped to his knees. The ground beneath him pulsed again, that same rhythm that had haunted him since the oak tree split open. It felt stronger now, closer. The earth began to shift, soil curling like waves under his palms. A red glow spread through the cracks, the same color that had poured from the pit before. The whispering grew louder, merging into one deep voice. Blood for blood, master for master, Benge screamed, clutching his head. The air shook with laughter, old and powerful. The colonel's voice mingled with the creature's, echoing through the land. You wanted freedom, but freedom always comes at a cost. The wind roared, ripping through the trees. The mansion's windows shattered, glass raining down like stars. The ground split again, this time wider, stretching from the house all the way to the fields. From the glowing pit rose shapes, not human, not ghost. Figures of black smoke, with faces that melted and reformed, each carrying the memory of a life lost on this cursed soil. Their cries filled the night, twisting into the sound of 1,000 voices calling Benge's name. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His feet sank slightly into the ground, like the earth itself was pulling him down. Elias stepped forward, his form flickering. Listen to me, there's one way left. The curse binds itself to whoever owns the land. Destroy the bond, and the land will rest. Benge's voice broke. How? Elias looked toward the mansion. The deed. The colonel's signature. It's still inside. Burn it. Benge turned and ran. The front doors flew open before he touched them. The grand hall burned with an unnatural red light. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming shapes of men with whips and torches. He raced up the stairs to the colonel's study. The room smelled of smoke and blood, though nothing burned yet. On the desk lay the deed, the paper yellowed and cracked but glowing faintly, like it was alive. The colonel's portrait above the fireplace seemed to watch him. Go on, the reflection whispered from the glass of the frame. Burn it, but remember, everything has a price. Benge grabbed a candle and held it close to the paper. His hand trembled. I'm ending this. As the flame touched the corner of the deed, the room screamed. The sound wasn't human, it came from the walls, the floor, the very air. The fire spread fast, black smoke filling the room. The portrait of the colonel caught next, his painted eyes melting into darkness. Outside, the ground convulsed. The glowing crack widened one last time, then began to close as the house burned. The spirits around the fields cried out, not in pain this time, but in release. One by one, they faded into soft light, rising toward the sky. Elias stood near the gate, his face calm for the first time. You did it, Benge. But Benge didn't answer. The mansion was collapsing around him. Flames licked the walls, the ceiling groaning. He stumbled down the stairs, but the door had vanished. Only fire and smoke remained. He turned back toward the mirror in the hall. For a moment, he saw himself again, his true reflection, tired and broken, but finally free. Then the fire swallowed everything. The next morning, all that remained of Haverford was ash. The land was quiet, no whispers, no cries. The curse was gone. Weeks later, travelers passing through the valley said the ground where the plantation once stood looked strange, blackened soil where nothing would grow. But when the wind blew just right, they claimed they could hear faint music, like the echo of an old ball in a forgotten mansion. And sometimes, at night, they swore they saw a single figure walking the fields. A man in old clothes, holding a burning piece of paper, whispering the same words again and again. Blood for blood. The legend of Haverford faded with time, but the story remained. Some said it was just folklore. Others said the land still waited, quiet, hungry, watching. Maybe curses never die. Maybe they just change their name. If you enjoyed this haunting tale of history and horror, don't forget to subscribe for more dark stories, share it with friends who love a good scare, and leave a comment about your favorite moment from Haverford's curse. Until next time, keep your lights low, and your soul safe.